This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Your former congressman every week sits down with interesting people who have a different worldview than I do. Aisha Mills, I have always been a fan of from afar, longtime political strategist, commentator, activist. You'll see her on CNN and MSNBC. She's doing some really interesting economic work that I'd love her to talk about before we close today. But Aisha, welcome. You grabbed my attention about a week and a half ago regarding the NAACP travel advisory for Florida, and you were on MSNBC, I think, with Nicole Walsh. Can you still hear me? Hold on, I think I lost Aisha Mills.
No, I hear you. I'm just making sure that I'm moving to a quieter location.
Oh, okay.
So that you don't hear my background noise.
Aisha's background, it was beautiful. She was sitting out on her deck. The birds were chirping. Now I can see the deck behind you. Now you've moved indoors. You still look great. Thank you. The NAACP travel advisory to Florida. You have always been so wonderfully outspoken. You were on MSNBC. You said some provocative stuff that I think I disagree with, but I so want to explore it with you. Let's start at the top. The travel advisory for the state of Florida. You generally support what the NAACP did, yay? Yes?
Yes, and just to add to that, I want to honor the fact that it was the NAACP, it was Equality Florida as well. Was it? A couple of groups came together in coalition that represent LGBTQ plus people, African Americans, immigrants, etc.
And everybody should know when it comes to Ron DeSantis and what my former party is doing. Aisha Mills and Joe Walsh are on exactly the same page. I can't stand DeSantis. I think he's cruel and a bigot, and he's an authoritarian. He's just like Trump. So everything Florida's doing, I oppose. Aisha, it was just the notion of a travel advisory, discouraging tourists from visiting Florida, just seemed kind of silly and over the top and counterproductive. But I need your perspective, and tell me it's not those things.
It's not those things. So I'll just start by saying this. I mean, I think that, we look at any other country. In fact, my family, we just went to spring break in Mexico this year in March.
Yeah.
And didn't realize that we were leaving literally like 5 days after a heightened travel advisory came out from the State Department about a variety of places in Mexico, including where we were going, because some Americans had been kidnapped. At least one of them had been murdered at that time. There was so much going on that the United States State Department does this in every country when they say, there are a lot of things happening here that are cruel. There's so many indignities that the people are experiencing. There may be violence. There may be state violence, state-sanctioned violence. So beware. That is exactly what the NAACP and other organizations have done for Florida. The United States is not immune from hatefulness.
True.
It's not immune from crimes against its own citizens. So many of the attacks that Ron DeSantis has waged on queer youth, on transgender people, on Black voters, on immigrants, on the education system writ large, against Disney. I mean, these things really feel like state-sanctioned violence in the state of Florida. And so to discuss that to put out a travel warning so that people really understand the level of what we're doing, of what we're dealing with there in terms of the policies and practices that are designed to do many people harm, I think is right on the money from an educational standpoint and a real analysis that says, it's not okay to, for example, turn our nose up at the entire country of Mexico because they may have some cartels that are out of hand, right? We completely issue lots of travel bans and advisories there. The same thing is happening in Florida in so many ways that's doing real people harm, real citizens harm who live there. And I do think it's important that we talk about it as such and not skirt around the issue. I also believe, Joe, and we can, get into this. I very much believe in the power of the purse string. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the piece of this that really reminds me, just as an activist, of what moves people, what ultimately creates structural change, is often really getting into the economics of the thing. I think about the fall of apartheid in South Africa was because of a boycott, was because people said, we're not going to spend our dollars with companies who are doing business and who are sanctioning the violence that's happening there. I think there is something to saying in Florida, hold on, before you go spend your money there, right? Think about how you're spending your dollars and where else they could be spent where people appreciate you more than if you go there and spend them. So that's
Aisha,
why I agree with it all.
That makes sense to me. I get that. I get the NAACP saying, look, what DeSantis and the Republicans are doing in Florida is cruel, and it's endangering the lives of the LGBTQ community, of people of color. It's this notion, though, of a travel advisory. But I think what's really important, and everybody listening to us and watching us needs to understand, Joe Walsh is a straight white guy. Aisha Mills is a black woman, a gay black woman, a lesbian black woman with a much different experience. So it's interesting to hear you speak that way, because I didn't react that way, but I get it. Now, the travel advisory specifically for everybody listening to us discourages tourists from visiting Florida because it's hostile to Black Americans this is from the NAACP, on a seeming quest to silence African American voices. The government and the state of Florida have shown that African Americans are not welcome in the state of Florida. Due to this sustained, blatant, relentless, systemic attack on democracy and civil rights, the NAACP hereby issues a travel advisory to African Americans and other people of color regarding the hostility toward African Americans in Florida. And as you said, LGBTQ organizations have done the same. Aisha, explain this to me. When I hear travel advisory, I hear it's not safe physically for people to go to Florida, people of color or people in the LGBTQ community. Is that your sense? Like, do you believe that it's not safe?
Absolutely.
Explain that.
I can tell you last week after that Nicole Wallace MSNBC appearance that I did,
I bet you heard from people.
I've been hearing from people. I'm getting all the nasty grams and the hate email and the nasty tweets, because one of the things that I said was that in 2021, this is kind of coming when we all finally started to open up a bit from COVID. Yeah. I actually took my family, so my fiance, who is a woman, and 3 bonus children who at the time were, 5, 10, and maybe 12. We went and vacationed in around 30A, which was the first time I'd even heard of 30A. Apparently it's called the Redneck Riviera, tongue in cheek. I did not know that either. It's beautiful there. Yeah. But my fiance, who is a lover of all things country western, was like, let's go to 30A. Like, it's going to be so cool. And when we got there as a Black lesbian-led family, immediately I felt like I didn't belong there. These weren't my people where we were, which is okay, because sometimes you're just not with your people, right? I live in the Hudson Valley of New York right now, which is extremely conservative. And there are a lot of Trump supporters and flags and things that make
Yeah.
me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The difference, though, in the climate that we're living in and what these kind of, I'll just call them terroristic policy acts that Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, what it does is it emboldens people who naturally would have a disconnection from me and my family, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it emboldens them to be aggressively vile against us. We see this in the ongoing verbal violence and assault in the streets and the stuff that I've gotten in my inbox over the last 7 days.
Yeah.
And you feel it in the animosity and the energy of people on the street. So, for example, I made the joke when we were going out to dinner. My mother-in-law to be was also with us, who happens to be a white woman. So
What
she's
did
a white
you,
woman.
Aisha, did you guys rent a place? What kind of an
We
area
did.
did you stay in?
We rented a house, beautiful
Yeah.
house in one of the kind of subdivision communities there. It was a
Okay.
big townhouse, had a pool in the community. We were walking distance from the beach.
Okay.
My mother-in-law is white. My fiance is biracial, and
Okay.
all the children are Black, and I'm Black. And we went out to dinner. And you could feel the looks like it just, that we were the only Black people there. I mean, we were just literally the only Black people in this community.
Yeah.
And it felt like Mar-a-Lago had kind of vomited out. Very wealthy, conservative people that, were looking at us as if we didn't belong there and kind of wondering
you
who are
felt
these.
that. Aisha, you
Oh.
felt that.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. And as a Black woman in America who also happens to be a lesbian, you very much feel the energy of eyes on you, of
Yeah.
not very friendly customer service, of, eyebrows raised about what you and your family are doing, and then kind of a curiosity about the makeup of your family when
Yeah.
it's all these women with these children.
Yeah.
All of it feels extremely uncomfortable. Here's the thing, though. It used to just be uncomfortable 10 years ago, right? Now I fear for my life because of the kinds of nasty things and death threats that I've gotten and the things that people have said to me. I actually campaigned last year in New York and also felt similar tone that I did in Florida with the things that people dare say to your face.
Yeah.
I was very much afraid to let the kids go ride their bikes by themselves because you don't know who might see my 13-year-old Black boy riding a bike in this white neighborhood and decide that he needs to be shot and accuse him of something that he didn't do. We see this all over America all the time. What Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida is emboldening people who have harsh sentiments to feel like they're entitled to act out on them physically and verbally. That's what's been so horrible. I mean, this. That's what's been so horrible about the Trump era.
Yeah.
And that is what Ron DeSantis reflects in Florida. So to answer your question, it's a long way of saying I absolutely personally fear for my safety and my family's safety in Florida because of the nature of the state and people just and also let's be reminded, we're talking right now, Joe, about queer people. We're talking about attacks on Black Americans, but we're also in a state that has done everything it could to eliminate gun laws. Right. So everybody's also walking around armed and dangerous and hostile. And that nothing about that feels safe. And I'm thankful that the NAACP and Equality Florida and others are reminding us to stay vigilant when we do visit the state because it isn't safe.
When, Aisha, remind me, when did you guys go there for spring break? What year was that?
We were there in 2021. Right after, so it must have been, I don't know, March or something like that. Kind of like,
and you felt, and in 2021, you felt this way. I would have to believe 2 years later in 2023, it's even worse. It's so interesting, Aisha, to listen to you. Did you feel like when you went out, you mentioned the quality of service you got. You felt looks from other customers. Did you feel kind of looks or something weird from the people who were serving you?
All the way around in the particular community that we were in. We drove about 10 miles or so south, kind of further down that panhandle, and ran into the lesbian commune. So then we found our people. So we were like, oh, we should have stayed here in the first place. Here are our people. But yes, we very much felt so. as I was there, I have a best friend who was living in Georgia at the time. And as I was there, I was just, texting with her. And she said, you know that they call that area South Georgia, right? And I said, well, no, I had no idea. We came because the Gulf is gorgeous and the beaches are beautiful. So we came as bona fide tourists to experience this lovely part of the United States where the water is awesome and the kids could just go to the beach and play without having any politic around it. And I think that's why it was so jarring for me to arrive, because I didn't go there with preconceived notions about how I would feel or the experience that I would have. I also, just to add to my Florida experience as of late, for a year from 2021 through 2022, I was with the Black News Channel, which is based out of Tallahassee. Yeah. And I hosted my own primetime show on the network called Amplified with Aisha Mills. And I was down in Tallahassee a few times just to record out of the studio. Tallahassee is an interesting place up there at the top of the Panhandle. It is very, very, very conservative. But here's the thing: when people like me who are Black and queer think of conservative, sadly, we tense up and we get afraid, because conservative isn't just, we have maybe different economic ideas and viewpoints. There's an entire climate that Trump and now Ron DeSantis have created that is peppered with violence, with hostility, with acting out of animus that literally makes me afraid for my life. And this is new, because I've been in politics for 25 years, Joe. I've been doing this work. I've been on the front lines of racial justice movement. I won marriage equality for us in 2009. Like, I have literally been on the front lines of social justice movements. I've worked in Texas. I've worked in Louisiana, and it is a different day in terms of the feeling of fretfulness and fear for personal safety. We saw it all play out at the Capitol with white people attacking other white people, right? Yeah. So it is a lot. And, I share this with everyone, not to have a pity party, but to say that if someone who is as tough and seasoned as an activist as myself can go into places now and very much feel the difference in the energy that is a direct product of the policies and practices of politicians who are emboldening the harshest underbelly of our society, then I can't imagine what it must be like for the average person to just live there and go to the grocery store, right, and just try to do their business.
Aisha, I think this is so good, and it's so fascinating for someone like me to hear, and for other white folk who are listening to us right now to hear, because when I heard the travel advisory story, I laughed and I said, okay, I get it. The stuff DeSantis is doing is horrible and bad, but you're not endangered. It's you don't fear for your body and your life. I mean, and I heard, no surprise, Aisha, from a lot of folks on my world on the right who said, Joe, that's such fucking bullshit. Why don't they issue a travel advisory for the South Side, for Chicago or St. Louis or Baltimore? All of that. And the only part of that I related to, Aisha, was when I hear travel advisory, I think physical safety. And that's why it seemed really over the top to me. But listening to you right now, you have not felt physically safe down there.
Not at all. And let me tell you where I come from. So I was raised and grew up in the state of New Jersey, but I was raised by my grandparents who were Black people from South Carolina. They were born and raised. I can actually trace my family back. I'm the 6th generation removed from a plantation in Union, South Carolina. Wow. We know where we come from and who owned us. Yeah. The vast majority of my people still live in Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina. Yeah. I spent my entire life upstate South Carolina hanging out with all my family. I come from people who know anxiety. My grandparents were a part of the Great Migration. They fled out of there in the 50s. This is during Jim Crow. They couldn't drink out of the same water fountains, couldn't go anywhere. And so for me, the South has never really been safe. The southern part of America has never really been safe to walk. the streets.
Aisha, to that point, if you went back down to South Carolina, to some of those communities in South Carolina, would you feel the same way?
There's so I'm actually going 4th of July weekend. We have our family reunion,
Okay.
which is I believe it's in Spartanburg this year, but I'll probably say in Greenville,
Okay.
which is now very developed and quite cosmopolitan.
It's become pretty cosmopolitan, yeah.
And the thing that has made some evolution there in terms of I wouldn't say that the politics of the place, but really just in terms of the cosmopolitan nature of the people, which makes it more friendly and welcoming, is that these are enterprising folks who have moved to Greenville for industry, for work, right?
Yeah.
They're more college educated people there than ever before. There are people who are interested in upward mobility for themselves and their children and their families. And so, and also a globalized perspective, people who are coming there that have more of a broader worldview than this, America first isolationist foolishness. And so just the mentality and the attitude of people who are global citizens and connected. Forget the politics. I don't care who you vote for, but just that alone creates a different energy environment when we're all out at the bar hanging out together and you're just chit chatting with strangers. I feel that shift and that change. And I think it's because of a broader open mindedness, politics aside. And what people like Ron DeSantis are attempting to do is they're fear mongering and they're playing to the lowest common denominator of the narrowest minded people who are the minority in this country, but the majority of his base. And I'm hoping that voters don't fall for it in this presidential, primary on the Republican side. But that's the thing that's most disheartening. So the growth that I feel, I just came back from Atlanta. Atlanta is obviously, a black city, and also there's a economic dexterity there of people that creates a whole different energy level. I wouldn't go an hour outside of Atlanta and feel safe.
Yeah.
But places that have more of a broader globalized, I think, growth tend to feel a little better. But today it's a Ron DeSantis story of Florida, but it has been an American story of the terrorism of southern states, period, against people who are not white, straight, cis, and male. Right? Because women have felt the fire too at any particular point in time in our history. And we're finally calling it what it is. And so I see these travel bans as really an evolution of the way that we talk about the reality of domestic terrorism. I feel that's what I see this as.
And that's interesting, Aisha. You said something with Nicole Wallace. And again, what I've always appreciated about you is you speak your mind. You said Florida is about to be a terrorist state for Black and LGBTQ people, a terrorist state. And again, I want you to explain this because from my perspective, when I hear terrorist state, I think of countries in the Middle East where if you're gay or queer or transgender, it's literally a death sentence. I think of terrorism like that. But explain what you meant by a terrorist state.
Well, let's just be reminded that a major act of terror happened in the state of Florida, probably the largest, one of the largest, mass shootings at Pulse nightclub, which is a gay nightclub that happened there in Florida. Okay, so, and that was recently. That was just the last few years. Here's what Florida's doing. So to use your analogy, Florida is banning books and censoring public discourse and education. So trans children are literally vulnerable right now and at risk in their own schools to being outed. God forbid they try to access any kind of health care, because at this point, Florida is also restricting health care access to people who don't identify as heterosexual, which is problematic. They are trying to control and dictate the types of words we use and don't use, period. There are so many parents who are fleeing the state because they don't feel like their kids are safe in their schools.
And Aisha, say this again. Trans children in Florida right now, you think are becoming physically endangered. Like they're
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, so the conservatives have been pushing, Republicans have been pushing what would have been called so-called don't say gay bills
right.
for over a decade. I mean, you
Yeah.
know this.
Yeah.
Joe,
Yeah.
they've been doing this for a long time. Well, it's actually starting to take hold. It's taken hold in Florida. The consequence of that is that by targeting transgender kids and saying that they are bad, that they are a problem, that there's something wrong with them, it then emboldens other kids to bully them, to harass them, to be violent against them, as well as adults in their schools. So what we're doing is we are absolutely creating a climate that says you can denigrate and do harm to certain classes of people. And that is what makes it so vile. And a direct analogy to, I remember when Secretary Clinton, when she was with the State Department, she was Secretary of State, and she's going around the world talking about women and trying to liberate women, essentially. It's the same exact thing in terms of the suppression that's happening to people, happens to be trans people and Black voters right now. But it's the same thing that's happening in Florida, and people are physically less safe. Let us not forget that it was just in Florida that you had a Black guy who was jogging, who was curious about a construction site, which, by the way, I pull over all the time and see what's going on. I actually have a development project here, so I'm kind of into what people are building.
Yeah.
I peep over and look all the time at construction sites. Black kid is jogging, looks at a construction site, and some vigilantes shot him dead because of it in Florida, because they thought they were emboldened to kill the Black guy who's in their neighborhood that doesn't belong there.
Yeah.
This is not hyperbole. This is what is actually playing out. Trayvon Martin, over a decade ago, right? Stand your ground. So we're seeing this happen. It's not, a hyperbole that it's happening. When you have Dwayne Wade, who is a hero, sports hero in Miami, say, get the hell out of this state because I have a transgender daughter and I would never want to be here and have my trans daughter growing up in a state like this that is so harsh and attacking against her. So it's bad. It is bad. And for those of us who really feel the wrath, I mean, I would say, to everyone who's listening, this is, in my humble opinion, Joe, not about partisan politics and whether, I agree with you as a Republican or not. This is really about common humanity. And I know a lot of people like you and so many others who believe deeply in treating everybody with dignity and respect, right? And that's not what's happening right now in the state of Florida.
Well, and Aisha, you've probably heard me say this before because I've had a very public redemptive evolution. And I was part of the right-wing media world, and I know, we all know, Tucker Carlson, Hannity, all of us knows who listens to us, middle-aged and older white people, and they're afraid of these changes. And so oftentimes in right-wing media, we feed those fears. I was guilty of that back in the day. And you're right, Aisha, it's now at the point where those listeners of mine, those voters of mine now have become radicalized and they're emboldened, and acts of violence are happening and more will happen. And DeSantis just feeds this shit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's, we're talking about kind of, I know I'm talking a lot about the interpersonal dynamics of the strange, crazy guy on the street in his pickup truck that decides he's going to try to run you off the road, which, by the way, happened to my fiance here in upstate New York.
Really?
Trump supporter. It did. So it's not immune to Florida, right? I mean, but we're not immune to the things happening in Florida. Yeah. But it's also the thing that is most egregious about this is that it really is state violence and criminalization of people with these laws that are creating criminal penalties, for example, against medical providers who are trying to provide health care to trans kids, right? There has long been criminal penalties that could be hurled at anybody who's just trying to register to Black people to vote if they don't jump through certain hoops. So what Ron DeSantis is doing by inscribing hatred into the law is literally creating a criminal a criminality around humanity. And that's what the terrorist act is. That's beyond interpersonal, somebody bullies you. That's quite deeper.
Well, that's interesting, Aisha, because you've called it state-sanctioned violence. Right? Like DeSantis has done these things. Individual acts of violence have followed. In essence, that's state-sanctioned violence.
Mm-hmm. And he got it from his president, Donald Trump, who, we look at January 6th, and that's exactly what that insurrection was about, right? The fact that so many people would descend on Washington armed. Yeah. I mean, just show up armed. Yeah. And try to topple the government is about all that we need to know about the way that they're moving and the way that they're really trying to incite a militia mentality among people to harm others. And that's what's a problem. And it is ground zero in Florida. I will say, though, that I'm glad to see that other Republican-led states are somewhat skirting away and trying to distance themselves from this and saying, well, we don't necessarily want to be like Florida. We don't want to pick a fight with Disney and look foolish because we lose billions of dollars in our state's economy and have people telling tourists you should think twice before you travel there, go to California instead. It's at the end of the day, it's silly. It's all silly. It's bad for Florida. It's bad for the Florida economy. It's certainly bad for Floridians. So all he's doing, is trying to get himself elected president. I don't know president of who, but not president of the masses.
Would the NAACP, Aisha, have been better served if they had just said, all right, boycott Florida. This is what they're doing. Fuck it. Don't go there. Boycott Florida. People of color and queer and the queer community. Boycott Florida. Instead of issuing a travel advisory, or is there no difference between the two? Is it really the same thing?
Well, I don't sit at their strategic tables, but I would imagine that this entire advisory was a very strategic conversation versus just a boycott. Okay. Because there are so many Black people and queer people already in Florida that are being affected, right? The travel advisory, though, to me, if nothing else, has been very clever in that it has created the space for us to have public discourse and an analogy around what's happening in Florida and liking it to other places where there are travel bans. And I have not heard any argument to suggest that the travel ban in Florida is any different than a quote unquote developing nation that we have travel bans against because of the different things that, the U.S. government might accuse those countries of doing. Similar things are happening in Florida. So it feels really appropriate to me as an analogy.
You rightly called Florida, Aisha, ground zero in this battle. Are we really talking about like a rural urban kind of a thing? Like, rural America, is it any different in rural America? Like if you, Aisha Mills, went with your family anywhere in rural America, would you feel the same sense of concern and fear as you did when you went down to Florida on that spring break? Or is it just southern rural? Or, what's your thought on that? Or is it really kind of rural anywhere?
This is interesting because the irony of all of this is that pre-Trump, there was very much a rural versus urban, right? Yeah. All these people, these low income people out in the middle of nowhere have all these ideologies that they're clinging to was kind of a stereotype and an assumption. I was in 30A in Florida, which, like I said, the nickname is the Redneck Riviera. It was very expensive to be there. These are wealthy people. Yeah. The people hanging out at Mar-a-Lago are wealthy conservatives. They are educated. They are urbanites. These are New York City people who transplant down to Florida. So what is interesting to me now is less of a geographic divide in terms of urban versus rural, but more of the philosophical divide of the white people who feel like they're losing something because immigration is on the rise, because Christian values are, being trampled over, or whatever their excuse is for this, right? And they live everywhere. These people live everywhere.
Yeah.
And those folks who are acting out, and then the rest of us. And they live everywhere. Texas is such an interesting example of this too, because there's so many, Harris County, for example, big liberal pocket, but then there's, a lot of people in Dallas, in Fort Worth, which are urban, that are really conservative too, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just urban or rural. I think that it really is just mindset. And when we looked at Trump's first election, when he got elected president, and you look at that exit polling data, it didn't break down that neatly. It didn't break down that neatly in terms of who supported him. So that was a wake-up call for all of us, that educated people are also holding a lot of these harmful ideologies. And I think we didn't expect to see that.
Well, and Aisha, what we're also seeing is kind of a transformation of both parties, college-educated suburban men and women, because in the Trump era, have gravitated toward the Democratic Party. And we're seeing working class, not just working class white people, but this Trumpist party continues to garner a larger share of the non-college educated working class black and brown folk as well. It's interesting, and it's, to me, it would be a concern of the Democratic Party. Like they're losing their stronghold of non-college educated working class folks. Do you buy that?
So two things. One, it is true statistically that more black men supported Donald Trump than have gone for a Republican presidential candidate in modern history. Sure. But that percentage is still negligible, right? Like we're still talking about 90-something% of black voters are voting for the Democrat, right? So I don't want to overstate a statistic as if that has like real bearing and meaning. It doesn't. It's not suggesting some like black flight from the Democratic Party by any stretch of the imagination. The thing that you just hit on, though, that does concern me, and I'm in working class blue collar America where I live, with a lot of law enforcement officers, people who work in corrections, some laborers, right? Is that we certainly, as Democrats, have done a poor job of really talking about the dignity of work.
Yes.
And keeping our laborers in the fold. So you see the Teamsters going for Donald Trump in a lot of places, right? Because they're also, white men, and a whole lot of grievance there, right? Yeah. But I do think that there is a whole economic policy conversation that, frankly, Joe Biden has tapped into, or at least tried to tap into, around working class white people, and trying to keep them connected to the broader coalition and seeing themselves reflected in the Democratic Party, because white grievance, at the end of the day, trumps most things. And if anything, the data has shown us in this Trump era is that white grievance and this fake idea of economic insecurity, because it's fake, it's not a real thing, but it's really this like white anxiety, trumps all things. That's it. And the people who have tapped into that know how visceral that is. And, that's a hard thing to fight, because we are a nation that, when we're honest with ourselves, has been built on this made up notion of like whiteness as a way to divide and separate, and has created a class of white people out of Europeans who at some point had also been, the bottom of the barrel here in our country, and said, wait a minute, if we let all of the Irish and the Italians and whoever else join the white club, we can create this white club so that the black people can continue to stay at the bottom. And so when you build a society based upon white supremacy, which is what that is, political imperative of white supremacy, you get what you get. Right. And that's what we're living through right now, is that the United States has always had a narrative of white nationalism and white supremacy. And so working class white people are, feeling that start to subside because of equality, because of civil rights, because of the calls for more justice and kind of seeing that play out a bit, because of women's liberation and all the
Yeah.
things. And that's just the truth of it. And it's unfortunate, and it's not it doesn't land well to hear it, right? Like, it doesn't make us feel good to say it, but it's just the reality of where we are. And it doesn't make everybody who's white today racist. Not at all. Not at all. But what it does acknowledge is that structurally, our entire democracy is based upon the idea of white supremacy as a way to denigrate Black people and keep us in bondage. And that's all we're seeing play out. And so when you have the ruling class, whether they're financially, ruling or not, when you have the ruling class realize that they're actually not ruling, well, of course, people are going to act out.
Aisha, I agree with all of that, and I've become woke to a lot of that, proudly woke to a lot of that. But do you also worry, and I'm not a Democrat, do you worry that the loudest voices in the Democratic Party are talking about and focusing on the wrong things? I hear from working class, non-college educated folk all the time, and they tell me, "Oh, Joe, yeah, the Republicans may be assholes, but the Democrats are talking about all this woke shit and all this gender shit, and come on, talk about what are you gonna do about gas prices and my jobs." And do you worry that the Democrats are getting tagged with this, that they're kind of out of touch with what is animating non-college educated folk?
Nope, not at all. I think that we can chew gum.
By the way, I want you to explain this, and I fucking love the way you just answered that. Nope, not at all. I love that.
Not at all. Not at all.
Explain
Not at all.
yourself.
Because I think that we can walk and chew gum. And the truth is that the beauty and the damn complexity of the Democratic coalition is that it is hella diverse. And so one message, we are not Republicans who are in lockstep and they're just going to like line up around something racist and everybody kind of march like the Nazi party and vote for like one guy. That's not what we do. We are diverse people. And so you have to speak to all the different communities that make up the Democratic Party. This woke shit, quote unquote, is actually foundational to the values of the next generation of Americans, period, full stop.
Oh,
that's it, right? So we got to talk about that. And we got to, and if anything, the thing that makes me nervous, I got to say, Joe, as a progressive, as someone who aligns more with the progressive side of the party and not the neoliberals, is that we don't, in my opinion, speak enough to the real justice-oriented progressive values of the younger people, the under 40 crew that are unreliable voters because maybe they show up, maybe they don't, maybe they show up in, the primary, maybe they show up on an off cycle, maybe they don't. That those are the voters who really are the voting bloc for the next 50 years. And I don't think the Democratic Party does enough to be consistent and on message and engaging and animated and excited them to show up when it's important. I also think that we can do way more to have conversations about work, about just kitchen table economics, right? Bread and butter stuff. We can sit around and talk about the damn debt ceiling all day long, but who gives a shit?
Right.
I don't care about the debt. I mean, so maybe if you say, oh, well, would you default on your credit card because the government's going to default on theirs? No one gives a shit about the debt ceiling, right? So how do we actually have real conversations about people in their pocketbooks? I think that we don't do that well enough, but I think we should be doing all the things. And the most galvanizing moments in recent history for the Democrats are when we've been able to hit all the notes. So, Barack Obama 2 times brought out a rainbow coalition. We've got, Joe Biden gets elected, and what's he run on? I mean, his first commercial was about the horrors of Charlottesville. And how he's going to run as an old white man to stomp out white nationalism. I mean, that was kind of his shtick. Yeah. And by the way, I'm from Scranton and I care about jobs, right? So you got to do it all. And
Aisha, have you lost? And I say this as a proudly woke conservative. Have you lost the narrative on woke though? Has the other side, that the right, who fucking pounds this shit every day. And I don't see the left defending what woke is. Have you lost the narrative on it?
No, because I don't think that the narrative of woke is actually the fucking point.
Okay.
I think that we are inherently woke. I don't think that you need to say it. It's kind of, it's kind of one of those things of me like walking around saying, well, I'm a black woman. Well, duh. Like, I don't need to repeat, I don't need to like introduce myself as Aisha, the black woman, right? I think that, the Republicans have a word to use to attack people with, and that shit only works with them. So who cares? But for those of us on the left, I don't believe that anyone is feeling somehow suppressed by this idea of wokeness or like wanting to recoil from the idea of wokeness. It's literally a framework. We wake up every day and we think that everybody should be equal and that our criminal legal system is unjust and that we all want to have good jobs and we're all freaking out because the economy is tanking. I mean, so the idea of quote unquote wokeness is just what we have always believed in terms of equity and constantly fighting towards that. We don't sit in our strategy meetings throwing the word woke up on the whiteboard. That's not what we're doing, right? Like we're not saying, okay, guys, we're going to be woke today. And so we've got to write woke here. And then this is what the definition of woke is. No, we're just living our values. Now, what the right is good at is corrupting values, right? But we are living our values. So Moms for Liberty may have good talking points at their school board meetings, but we're not being derailed by that. And I have talked to voters I ran across 3 counties in upstate New York, which are relatively conservative counties. And not one person that I encountered was concerned deeply about wokeness. They were concerned about the fact that IBM is gone from here. Yeah. So there's like really like a flight and there's just not like good jobs. They're also concerned that the kids growing up here aren't feeling stuck because this is not the kind of place that you grow up and then you go work and then you stay in your small town. It used to be everybody's kind of trying to get out, go to the military, go to college, go do something to kind of get out of your little narrow neighborhood so that you can have economic mobility. But now these kids are stuck living at home until they're 30 because they can't afford to go off to college, because they can't afford to go elsewhere. Yeah. So there's so many things that are not about wokeness that actually end up being about money, that are what constantly resurfaces over and over again. And the last thing I'll say about Ron DeSantis is, which is just always so surprising to me about the hypocrisy of these right-wing nut jobs, is that on one hand, Republicans care so much about economic mobility and dexterity and we all should be able to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and do all these things. And he is completely fucking the economy in his state, literally. Telling Disney to go go off. And so it just doesn't make any sense to me. The people who claim they care so much about working class people actually don't give a damn about working class people at the end of the day. And that's just the irony. But again, whiteness is whiteness. And so whiteness trumps the working class at the end of the day.
I hear what you say about woke, and it makes sense for you not to have to wear woke on your sleeve. But Aisha, you know my history as a former Tea Party hellraiser who's seen the light in the last few years. I proudly put that word out there. Hey, one more question on the travel advisory. You said one more thing that I recoiled from. But as I listened to you, everything you said that I recoiled from as I listened to you and Nicole Wallace is making sense to me, damn it. You said the travel advisory turns a lens on the U.S. and highlights how bigotry and bias and ignorance do as much harm as we accuse other countries of doing to people they oppress. Again, I hear that and I think, oh, come on, Aisha. Yes, a lot of bad shit here, but we're not as bad as some of these other countries that quite literally, I'll let you go at that. Explain yourself, my dear.
Yeah, we are. I mean, that's the thing. Yeah, we are. White people have had the luxury of living in a fantasy land of what Americanism supposedly is, which has never applied to the rest of us. It's never applied to the rest of us. And so we've always been, I mean, my grandfather fled South Carolina as a young man in his early 20s because he was being harassed. He worked his ass off picking peaches because that's all they could do. He worked his ass off sharecropping, picking peaches, and he bought himself a little car. He was the oldest boy in his family. He had 8 siblings, and his father wasn't in the home. And so he was able to ditch the draft because he was the eldest man and the boy in the home at that time. And so he bought himself a little car to get him and his mother around and do whatever. Well, these white men kept, he's black boy should not have a car, right? How dare you have a car? Because I don't have a car, because these white guys didn't have a car, right? They used to mess with him. And he ended up finally having like a physical fist fight beat the shit out of a white boy at the gas station. And when he got home, because this is how the South works, y'all know this, those of you who live in the South, his mother had already heard about it. By the time he got home, had already heard what happened at the gas station. It already got to her. And she said to him, you're going to need to get on out of here, right? Because somebody's going to come for him because he beat up a white man. And this guy, my pop-up was working his ass off to have a little car, because he had all these siblings and he was like proud of being able to have his little car to do what he needed to do to get around. He was the man of the house to like take care of his family, and he just couldn't live. He couldn't even have a car. Right. Yeah. And it was such an indignity to these white people who couldn't afford a car. Right. They just standing around talking their own shit to him. We have never had the luxury of having the same existence, and certainly not LGBTQ people. I mean, we could still be fired. So this is the thing that people need to remember. We can still be fired from our jobs in most states in this country at this point still, because we are LGBTQ. Now, sure, the federal government says we could get married. Yay, that's great. But I can be married and still not be protected from employment discrimination and lose my job because the boss just doesn't really like that I'm a lesbian and it's like, whatever, like because we are not a protected class in America. We don't have civil rights as LGBTQ people in America. Now we kind of have civil rights as Black people, right? And we're constantly fighting to hold on to those. But the fact that we are fighting for equality under the law still today is all that we need to know about how unequal we actually are.
Aisha, that's fascinating to hear. And I come to this word, oppressed. We think in America that there are people oppressed in other countries. You have spent 40, 50 minutes making vividly clear that oppression is still very active in this country as well. I'm going to close with one personal question, but I need to say something to you. And this is, I want to, if I were with you right now, I'd give you a hug. Every week I sit down with people who don't think like me because I don't want to sit down with people who think like me. And yeah, we try to find common ground, but in most of these conversations, maybe we'll find a little bit of nuggets of actual common ground on issues. We learn to respect each other's humanity and understand why people think the way they do. But literally finding common ground on guns or any of the issues is hard. I went into this conversation convinced in my head and my heart that the travel advisory was a stupid, silly, counterproductive thing. I've spent 50 minutes listening to you, and something happened, Aisha, that has really never happened in the year and a half I've been doing this. You changed my mind. Oh. You completely fucking changed my mind. You've convinced me. You've shown me, as you said, the travel advisory was a really smart, clever thing to do. This has never happened in my conversations. I started at one side. I'm now on the other side, and it only took 50 fucking minutes. I say, Aisha, I say thank you to that. And I think I've got people from the far right to the far left who listen to this podcast. I would dare say that a number of people will have the experience I just had. I thank you for that. I want to close with a personal question. You are a public person, as am I. What's one thing, Aisha, that you wish people understood about you? It's my favorite question.
Ooh, I love that question. Well, Joe, let me just first say thank you so much for having me on your show, because in the evolution of my public facing career, I have grown to have much deeper respect for these kind of conversations with people who are not just the echo chamber of what you already believe, right?
Yeah.
Because having dialogue is so important. A piece of us has the opportunity to die through that and kind of create space for expansiveness, right? And, I set out on these conversations and, with people like Nicole Wallace, who's one of my favorites, because just as someone who has literally, both of you, literally been in the middle of all of the conservatism, can just share so eloquently to educate the rest of us about what that looks like inside. I love being on her show, and I love having these conversations because I'm no longer out to change people's minds, right? I don't want to argue for a living. I want to expand my own thinking and my relationships and my respect and appreciation for people. And I hope that in talking to me, other people have some expansiveness too. So thank you for creating the forum for that.
And everybody listening, I want them to understand it. The purpose of this podcast is not to change people, not to change my mind or me change your mind. This is not a debate. This is a conversation. And I know you didn't come into it thinking, I'm going to change Joe's mind on the travel advisory. I certainly didn't, because I know you well enough. I'm not changing your mind. But what you did was you told me why you said what you said and why you believe what you believe about it. And I understood it, and it expanded the way I thought about it. And that convinced me that your viewpoint makes a lot of sense.
And, and that goes to the answer to your question. What do I want people to take away and really know about me? Is that the politics are extremely personal for me. This isn't some, partisan day job, right, of hackery. I shared with you a bit about my family and my roots and where I come from. We come from a struggle. And I also come from military family. Both of my grandfathers went into the Navy as ways to escape Jim Crow. That's how we got out of the South. Yeah. They were Navy. Both of the highest ranking one was a chief. He ended up being a chief in the Navy. And, the thing about my experience as a Black woman, as a lesbian, is certainly upfront and close encounters with oppression and discrimination all the time, right? Just the microaggressions and the this and that. But the other piece of this is that I very much believe that there's, as Bill Clinton would say, that there's nothing that's wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right about it. And I very much believe in the pushing and the tension and all the stuff that has to happen in our democracy in order for us to realize those better ideals. And so, yes, the politics are very personal for me, and I fight for justice because I understand what it feels like to have, to be on the other side of it. And I would hope that folks who may not agree with me would just stop and pause sometimes to imagine how it would feel in your community if the police shot somebody dead in the street and that body laid there all afternoon while the neighbors just kind of stood around crying and gawking, right? And then, praying that there might be justice around the death of that person. The trauma that would happen if a little boy was coming home from school and was shot dead in the broad daylight in your neighborhood, right? There's so much of this that is deeply personal, which is why I understand, the people who have no personal experience of any of this trauma and don't get it. So I try to talk about the personal side of it because this is about people. It's about humans. It's about neighbors. It's about family members. And if we can all find some way to have that sense of understanding, I can't see why we all wouldn't be woke when it comes to issues around people and humans.
Amen. Follow her on Twitter, Aisha C. Mills, Aisha C. Mills. Follow her on Twitter. Thank you. You've been wonderful, Aisha. Thanks so
Thank you,
much for
Joe.
this.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.